So we look at our first proof. What's missing there? There's nothing written as given, right? But do we know what was given? What do I know was given? Okay. We said AB, AD. One of these two, right? Okay. How about the other two? Okay. He's so loud. Okay, we know that from the picture, so we don't even need necessarily to write that's given. Now,
I could say A, B, C, D, E. As long as it's grouped together with multiplication.
what else is different in what we've seen so far? Should have your notes out on 3-4. What are we being asked to prove? Is that different than what we've seen so far? So far, what have we been asked to prove before? The triangles are congruent. So we've added on this extra piece. Can we show these triangles are congruent? Let's do that. So let's write the given. So we got AB congruent to AD. We have AC congruent to AE. And we're just going to focus on the triangles and see where that leads us. All right, I got two parts. I got two sets of sides. I need one more set of information, maybe another side, maybe an angle, to see how the triangles are congruent. What else do we have in that picture? Let's go through our list. Is there anything parallel there? Nothing parallel. Do I have reflexive property? No. Anything about a midpoint? Anything about a bisector? But what happens at these angles at this funny looking bow tie? Oh, they're vertical. Are their vertical angles congruent? All right, so let's write that one in. Angle CAB and angle EAD. All right. Does that tell us anything about angle C and angle E yet? What does that tell us now? What do we know about those two triangles? Ah, they're congruent. So let's write that in. I already named them right here, so I'm just going to use the same name. And just instead of angle, I'll make it triangle. CAB is congruent to triangle EAD. Now the important part. How are those two triangles congruent? Now, let's think. We can always eliminate. We got 4 options. How many sets of sides do we have? 2. We only have one option of our triangle congruences that has 2 S's. Does that one work? Remember the order that we write it in tells us a lot. That's telling me that the angle is not between the sides. But isn't the angle where the sides meet? Yep. And then if we spelled that one backwards, we wouldn't be using it. So, this triangle, like some of you, has SAS. Side, angle, side. Okay, we have that. Triangle's congruent. Now that actually does a lot for us for angle C and angle E. Because back beginning of this chapter, if you went and flipped to the front page of your notes, you would have said what about congruent figures or congruent polygons? You can flip in the front now and look at it. What's it say about congruent polygons? Congruent corresponding parts. So, do I have congruent triangles? Yes. Do congruent triangles have congruent corresponding parts? So, we've done that process, nothing new than what we've seen all week. Now we can say that those two parts are congruent because the triangles are congruent. So, this is a long statement, corresponding parts of congruent triangles which is what we have. It's probably important because it's also the name of the section today. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. That is our reason that the angles would be congruent. Now, in this problem that we've started with, we started with some given stuff. We started with the vertical angles. Those pieces were accounted for. The nice thing is with the minimum of those pieces, we know the whole triangles are congruent. And if the triangles are congruent, all the things that match are congruent. I could go in and say stuff about B and D, CB and ED. I could change this problem. Maybe I want to make this a test question, but I don't want to give you all the same question. And I go in and say, all right, forget C and E. Half of you are going to have to show that angle B is congruent to angle D. It's the same thing. You get down to the end, once you get triangles are congruent, the corresponding parts of those congruent triangles are also congruent. Now, we shorten this up. Because saying corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, it's rather long. So you could also say CPCTC. But you need to make sure you understand what that means. So blindly writing CPCTC is probably not a good strategy. But it's what we're going to use today. So, this week so far, you've been taking congruent triangles, finding how they're congruent, kind of getting through the proofs. Today, we just add one more piece to that. And this is it right here. They're going to give you a way to get to the triangles, and then you take whatever you're trying to prove and say, well, hey, the triangles are congruent, so those corresponding parts are also congruent. You still got to be able to identify them. You still have to work through the proof, but we just added this little piece onto it. So let's take another look. Here's your next one. Where's your notes? Get them out. So we're missing again the given. But we know what we want to get to. Our goal here is to show that A and B is congruent to A and C. That's the two angles at M. In the picture, it kind of looks like they're right angles. So maybe they're congruent. But we need to show that because maybe it's off just a little bit by the picture. In any case, what's given to me? Okay, whoops. AB. All right, let's see what we got so far. We got AC is congruent to AB. What else do you want? What else do you got? We got a reflexive, okay. AM is congruent to AM. All right, now I've used the given that was labeled. I had reflexive property. But in order for me to say that the two triangles are congruent, and get to that end step of CPCTC, or corresponding parts, so on and so forth, do I have enough information? How many pieces of information do we need to show triangles are congruent? We need 3. We got 2. Well, we need something else. I was actually withholding information. We know that M is a midpoint of BC. So we're going to write that in as another given, or you could just write it down below reflexive if you've already written down. But we're going to put M as the midpoint of B, or BC. Now, in doing that, I didn't want to show it, just like keep it from you and get you stuck. I want you to understand, sometimes they give us the information for a reason. You have enough information there. If you're looking at a proof and you're stuck, you look for the shortcuts, but you also need to use the given. Now, if M is the midpoint, what does that tell us? Why would they say it's a midpoint? What congruence does that lead to? I look over here. It's a midpoint. Is anything congruent if M is in the middle of B and C? Is this segment and this segment the same? No. Why else would they tell us? We're going to use that as congruent. So MB is congruent to MC. Now, if that's what a midpoint is, why are those two congruent? Is it because it's a midpoint? If we flipped to the back of our book and looked up midpoint, would it say that it gives us those congruent parts? It's in the middle, so it gives congruent segments? Yeah, that's its definition. Let me say definition of a midpoint. Now, a key part there is you got to pick up the midpoint, get you that congruence. But let's get back to the bigger picture. Do we now have 3 statements? Okay, with those 3 statements, how are those two triangles congruent? Do we have any angles? No, so side, side, side it is. Doesn't even matter which order you write the S's in. All right, then we're going to go AMB and AMC. I picked those because, well, that's the name of the angles, and they already named the triangles for me. So now that I have the two triangles are congruent, we can go that step further, get what it asked for. Oops, I need an angle. And why are the two angles congruent? Yep, CPCTC. Or corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Get to the triangles, everything else works. Would every other congruent or corresponding angle pair also be congruent here? Angles at B and C, are those congruent? Yeah. The angles that meet at A, also congruent. Because you get the triangle congruence, we can go that step further. Now, most of what you need to know stops right here. But you're going to have this little add-on where you're going to put that on the end. And we notice this when they give us something that's not triangles. So maybe you write that off to the side in your margin. When you're proving angles or sides congruent, you're going to use CPCTC as your last step. And you still get triangle congruence. Don't get me wrong there. You still need that. But when you're proving angles or sides congruent, CPCTC is that last reason after triangle congruence. Everything else is the same. That last line is really the new piece we have. Okay, here's your next one. What are your givens? Tell me what the givens are, and I'll let you work on trying to create your own. Write it out on your own. What are my givens? OM is congruent to what? Okay. And? Okay. So there's your two givens. You need to find a third congruence. Show the triangles are congruent. Then how M and R are congruent. Let's give that a shot. Okay, third line. Reason. What's the reason on the third line?
Reflexive.
Reflexive. It shows up all the time. It's not we have to sit there and solve for it. We got reflexive. What's nice is in a problem like this is when I have OE congruent to OE, is in doing that with the givens along with the reflexive, I got congruence. What's the congruence type? Perfect. Okay? Now you got to name the triangles. You have to go make sure you go in the right order. That is an important part. I'm just going to name one of them, and then I'll make sure the second one matches. So how do you want to name this one? OME, okay? Now, OME, what is corresponding to O in this triangle? It's not O. If we look at O in this one, O is between the 1 and the 3. What's between the 1 and the 3 in this triangle? E. So we're going to go E. Then we went M. What's corresponding to M over here? R, down in the corner. And then last, it'd be O. Yeah. As long as you make sure they match up. We kind of got ourselves in trouble because in the naming the sides, we don't really have the corresponding. They're kind of flipped, but make sure that's good. Okay? Now we know M is congruent to R, our angles. Why? Because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Expect a quiz question that asks you what CPC-TC stands for. It's great that you can use it, but you need to know what it is, and not just blindly writing it down. All right, now let's kind of give a summary here. Write this down if you need to. I wouldn't put it on the blank page because probably need some space for homework problems. If you want to kind of write what we have in the margin, if you just want to watch it, it's up to you. I just want to make sure where we're at so far. Okay, so you start with a diagram. You also get some givens. Okay, after that, we usually have to find something else. Okay, the givens, it's usually one, maybe two congruences that help us out, but sometimes we need a little bit more. So our other steps, we'll call them. Most popular one we see is reflexive. You guys are getting pretty good with that. And reflexive property is just that shares a side. Another one we get is vertical angles. Vertical angles, they're there. Maybe you get something that says midpoint or a bisector. And that usually comes from the givens. They say this is a midpoint or this is an angle bisector, whatever the case. In that circumstance, you're usually going to make either the sides congruent, or if it's an angle bisector, the angle's congruent. but they'll give you that, and then you'll use it in that next step. The other one we have is parallel lines. If you get parallel lines from the given, there's most commonly two directions you could go. The first is alternate interior angles. Which is going to look usually like this. The other is corresponding. Now that one showed up a little bit on the practice page you guys got. And corresponding will usually be if like the triangles are next to each other. If these were parallel, you'd go those being corresponding. Okay? What am I forgetting? Okay, so you start with the picture. You're given some information, maybe some congruences, or maybe something that leads to these. We then take all of that stuff together to get to triangle congruence. We got four options. When you do that, you'll then name the two triangles that are congruent and by which one. Now, we have four now. We'll add a fifth one next week. That's a special case. This is the big thing you need to know how to do. The new part from today is that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, which means that if the two triangles are congruent, everything's congruent. Okay? All the markings are there. That diagram's not correct. But we get that new piece. This is the process for every single one of them. All three of those problems we did today, all of the problems you did the last 2 days, it follows that same thing, even if it's not a proof. Even if it's just, hey, which congruence is it? You get some information, you figure out which one of these show up, and these are usually your next steps to get you here. We have to be able to do that process. Now, this doesn't cover everything, but these are the common ones. I told you guys, there's only so many different ones we can throw at you. There's a lot of repeats. Givens, reflexive, givens with the vertical to get the congruence is a very popular one. Alternate interior shows up. We see that probably the next. We've learned to recognize these. It follows the process. So, your assignment I'll put up next. Out of the book, you have the extra practice page. I want you to try to finish up. You're going to work on that. But looking at this, let's make this easier. Does this problem look familiar? Why does it look familiar? Yeah, we just did it. We're not going to do it again on homework, so that one's gone. How are these two triangles congruent? Side, side, side. What's the other piece of information, the other step I would mention? Getting ahead of yourself. Go back, right here. Which of these shows up on 5? Reflexive. So we'd go reflexive, side, 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 and then angle U is congruent to angle E by? Fantastic. We got that. That one's gone. Let's look at 8. Reflexive. How are the two triangles congruent? Side angle side, which means S and O, CP, CTC. Fantastic. So you're going to do 1, 4, 7, 9. That's your assignment.